So I was asked to come and talk about Standard 6. So I'm going to show the context of the Standard 6 rollout as we're moving forward this year and provide you the background information. And then I'll do a question and answer time and answer any questions you have around Standard 6. Standard 6 is part of the teacher evaluation system and also the principal evaluation system. And that is associated with Senate Bill 191, the Educator Effectiveness Law. Every teacher and principal, basically every educational employee is required by this law to be evaluated 50% on performance and 50% on practice. And we'll get into that. But also around the same time, Senate Bill 212 called for a redesign of the state assessment system. And so that called for the state assessment, which at the time was CSAP, now is TCAP, which is the transitional assessment, to be redesigned to assess the new Colorado academic standards. In addition, it added layers of additional assessment practices to be incorporated into school practice. The third one is Senate Bill 163, and that's the school accountability law, and that switched us from the old accountability system to what we have now, which are the school performance frameworks that the state assigns to schools, and the district performance framework that assigns our accountability rating at the district level. With the rollout of those three laws and those laws having state accountability requirements, and then the local accountability associated with the teacher evaluation system, we wanted to make sure that there was alignment with all of those requirements. So it's been a very step-by-step and thoughtful process in going through building the initial framework of Standard 6, and so we'll look at what that looks like. This is the teacher evaluation system. Half of it is green, which is practice. Half of it is blue, which is performance. The practice side has elements within each of those standards that determine the effectiveness of a teacher on instructional practice and on other elements of it, professional practice. Standard 6 is the entire 50% on the blue side. State law requires that in every educator's Standard 6, they have data that is associated with individual attribution and collective attribution. It's important to know that the only data that goes in the blue side is student performance. So any information about a teacher's impact on student performance that is related to practice will be on the practice side. All the data that will be on the blue side, the performance side, will be student performance. The individual attribution is the educator's impact on their own students. So the students that they are the teacher of record, and they have direct instructional responsibility for those students. And the collective attribution is my role as a teacher in being a contributing professional to the entire school. The law is very specific in that both of these have to be in every educator's Standard 6, and that the collective is aligned to the school improvement plan so that there's alignment at the school level. The individual attribution side is 80%-ish, and the collective is 20%-ish. Now, this decision of the weighting of individual to collective came from the work that we did with the teacher, or the Standard 6 task force. So we had, from January to April of this year, worked with representatives from all kinds of different teacher groups to look at what percentage of my evaluation do I want my students to be represented, and then the entire school's performance represented. And so this is where we're landing. The reason why I say ish is because as we run the statistical analytics and we check for fairness and accuracy and transparency. We want to make sure that there's not false positives or false negatives. So we want to make sure that it accurately represents the performance that's in the data. The way we get from what happens in schools every day to this evaluation result is the balanced assessment system. That's BAS, sorry, another acronym, but it was too big to fit in there. So balanced assessment system is what comes from Senate Bill 212, and that's around all of the assessment practices that are used in a school to help monitor the progress of students. So every school has a balanced assessment system, and that balanced assessment system is all students all the time. And it's very intentional that the balanced assessment system is focused only on students. We don't want teacher evaluation and daily student work to be mixed, because we don't want there to be any uneasiness with the teacher to attend to the progress of every single one of their students. So the balanced assessment system is all students all the time. And there's a student body of evidence for every single child from that balanced assessment system about their child's progress. So that's the intent of the balanced assessment system. And then from there, we have to go all the way over to a standard 6 rating. So we'll talk about that, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to tell you a little more about the balanced assessment system, because one of our commitments in my office this year is to really educate parents about the balanced assessment system. I'm working with the communications office. We really want to get the message out about what it is, what you can expect from it, the different types of practices. So I wanted to address that a little bit. So Senate Bill 212 requires that the balanced assessment system include summative assessments, and that's what happens at the end of the learning. Did you learn or didn't you not learn? That's checking on whether you're on track. The interim assessment practice is benchmarks along the way that we're able to compare. Here you are, that's where you need to be, we know how far. Or here's where you are, and here's where you needed to be, so you're way far ahead, so how do we change the learning target so it's actually moving you forward? And then formative assessment practices are very frequent. It happens all the time in teaching, and it's an integral part of the teaching and the learning. So these categories are part of the balanced assessment system, but they're artificially separated. So if we look at the next view, this is actually what happens in a classroom. Teaching and learning is happening, and assessments are woven throughout the teaching and the learning. So the teaching is really carried out through a balanced approach. And formative assessment practices, interim assessment practices, and summative are woven throughout that teaching and learning experience. So students can track where they are along the way, teachers can adjust instruction as it goes. So that's what's happening in the classroom, that's the practice that's occurring, and that's what will produce these student results that will then become part of Standard 6. So again, here we are with the balanced assessment system, all students all the time. From there, there will be decision rules that will be built into the system about several different factors. One is which assessments. It would be daunting if every single assessment a teacher used, every practice they used, had to go into their Standard 6. Plus, it wouldn't be accurate, because some formative assessment practices are so early in the learning that it would give a false representation of student performance. So we have to determine which assessments do two things. One, are the best representation of student performance, and two, are also the best representation of teacher impact on student performance. The other factor is which students. If I have a student who just walked in my class 2 weeks ago, in the balanced assessment system, I am on point. They are part of the progress I'm checking into. But they're not part of my body of evidence for my evaluation. They've only been in my class for a week. So we have to determine which students are part of that Standard 6. And then which results? And what I mean by that is it a final score? Is it a pre-post comparison? So all of those factors have to be considered to determine what kind of an analysis we can do on the student performance. All of those factors will suck out data from the balanced assessment system and pull it into the teacher body of evidence. So now the teacher has a body of evidence that represents the factors that are accurately representing their impact on student performance and represent a fair representation of that. Then we have the analysis of what was my impact on my students' performance. And so the question is, what was the student growth expectation? How much progress was expected? And then did students make that expected progress? And that then calculates into the educator's impact rating. And that results in Standard 6. We're doing a very purposeful rollout of CITE 6 with the schools this year. It is incredibly complex. And we've never done this in the state of Colorado. There are a couple of districts that do evaluation based on performance, so they have had that practice in place. Douglas County has never done that, and most of the districts in Colorado have not. We do have examples throughout the nation. Most of those examples are not great examples. You may have read in media different reports of what happened in LA, what happened in New York, and those. So we want to be very careful of the way we proceed. So we are working directly with schools. Every school has a committee that is represented by teachers of different teacher groups, and those teacher groups will work with the school leadership to make the decisions about their Standard 6 model. And we will roll that out slowly, and at the end, every teacher and principal will be able to review what student results are in my data for Standard 6 and determine if there's an accurate and fair calculation of their rating. So this year, there's two important considerations. One is that the state is holding this as a hold harmless year. So that means that it has whatever the rating is, it doesn't start the evaluation track going related to SB 191. And the other part is that the district is holding it as a hold harmless year. So that as well, we have time to validate the system, test it, and make sure that it's accurate before there are any consequences that are connected to it. So that's that. Questions?
First of all, will this apply to all schools in the district, including charters?
The question is, does this apply to all schools in the district, including charters? Originally, SB 191 did not apply to charters. Recently, there's been some action related to that, and so some of the charters are choosing to get right on board and start this process. Others are holding back to see what the final answer is.
So my second question is, it was clear how teachers are being evaluated with this presentation, but unclear how administrators should be evaluated.
So teachers and principals, teachers of record, which are teachers that directly instruct students for the majority of their workday, and principals, administrators of all sorts, are to be evaluated this year. In October, the Standard 6, the Standard 6 committee for the principals begins, and we will we'll go through the same process of building the model. However, their elements that have to be in the model are different. So
if I heard you correctly, that you have not built the administrator's model yet?
No.
Okay.
No. And if there's an interest from DAC to have an update on that, I can do that when we have the structure in place.
Who will be setting the student expected growth rates?
It depends on the measure. So the question is, who will be setting the student growth expectations? If it's a school-wide measure, then it's the school that sets the growth expectations, the student growth expectations, some measures already have that built in. So if it's a third-party external assessment like MAP, the student growth expectations are already built in the tool. Some assessments that schools maybe have developed, the school will determine the expectations. And if it's a classroom assessment, then the teachers will set the student growth expectations.
What kind of guidance will the teachers and the school have? Did I understand you right that each school will have their own committee of teachers who will determine what assessments they're going to use to gather their body of evidence? So if each school is doing that separately, how do you then compare the schools to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same playing field, or we're getting the same kind of feedback for our kids that, I have kids at 3 different schools.
So the question is, with all the schools setting their models and having the different committees working on that decision-making process, and then having the teachers including measures in their body of evidence, and then how is there consistency of that the expectation is the same? So there are 2 factors that are system-wide. One is that the educator impact rating will be the same for the entire district. So it won't be, at this school, there only has to be 70% growth, and at this school, there has to be 90% growth. So that's part of the process. And then part of the process is building the quality of practice. So as we are evaluating the quality of the assessments and then setting targets to them, part of that will be associated with 1 through 5. So if I'm setting my targets too low, then my ratings in my practice would be reflected.
Okay, and this is a statewide thing. This is not just a Douglas County thing.
Right, so the question was, this is a statewide thing. SB 191 requires every district in the state evaluate educators, 50% practice, 50% performance. And we had the option as a state or a district of selecting, completely selecting the state model and implementing the state model, creating part of it, using part of the state, part of ours, or creating our own. And there's a handful of districts that created a local evaluation system and had to align it to the state system. There's a couple of districts that also did a hybrid model, and then the rest of the districts adopted the state model. Most of our districts in the state are very small, and so their capacity to do that work is limited.
On the left-hand side of the pie chart, for some of the softer things like climate, culture, and professionalism, how are the teachers evaluated on that, and who evaluates them? Is it just the principal who determines whether or not they're satisfactorily meeting those criteria?
So the question is, on the evidence on the practice side, the evidence that's collected for those elements, who ensures that there's inter-rater reliability to that? So what we do is we have a mid-year evaluation point and then the end-of-year evaluation point, and the teachers are providing their evidence within some type of e-portfolio or collection of that evidence, and then different raters can look at that. That's one process. And the other process is after the results are finalized, then we take the data, my office takes the results, and we actually run analysis of inter-rater reliability. And what we do is we look at the elements and compare elements and say, if this element has to do with assessment and this element has to do with assessment, are you scored similarly? And those kinds of things to determine any red flag areas. And then we can help build the understanding and capacity of principals to be able to evaluate those consistently.
So, but the principal has the total responsibility for evaluating the teacher completely.
Yes.
We have a
I've heard talk
second
a lot
mic.
about assessments and about actually taking tests in class, but I haven't heard a lot about. I've heard you talk a lot about assessments and tests, but I haven't heard you talk a lot about classroom time. How much classroom time is our kids going to be impacted by with all of us assessing?
Ask the question, the last part of your question again?
how much of the kids' classroom time is going to be impacted by all of these assessments?
That's an excellent question. She's asking how much classroom time. We've taken our assessment calendar, and we have listed on the calendar every assessment that the state requires that we give. And the calendar is overwhelming. So one of the things that we're doing is we're working with the state, and we've had a number of conversations with the state, and we're not the only district that's doing this, which is good, because so we are working with them to consider what are our alternatives to these demands that are in each of these laws. Because the law that's not on there, that's hitting elementary schools, is the READ Act. So that's another law that has assessments attached to it. Our position in the assessment office is that the best practices are the practices that are completely relevant to teaching and learning. And the practices of testing that are external to that are not as useful to the classroom teacher. So we are doing what we can. I would say that as parents, you have a voice as well, and that voice can be heard on Capitol Hill, because we need your help too in making sure it's understood. We want meaningful assessing in our schools, and we are doing as much as we can to promote that.
I have a couple questions. My first is, how are you training principals to do the evaluations? What kind of training are you going through with principals?
Well, the training associated with Standard 6 is happening in numerous settings, and there's also a resource site available to them with all of the materials and training that we've gone through that they can reference. And then there's an ongoing, by my office, an ongoing support that's a standby or by need basis. If they need us to come out, we support them in that. And then the third element of training is that they're then implementing what they are actually learning and helping their staff understand it. So that then brings up the questions that are additional that haven't been answered in their original trainings.
Was there any thought about using outside evaluators? I know in other states they've had a lot of concern about the fact that principals already have so many responsibilities. They're already really taxed. This asks them to add another huge responsibility onto them. So in some cases they're using principals and outside evaluators. In some cases they're just using all outside evaluators. Was there any discussion about that?
Absolutely. That's an issue that then comes to resource allocation. Because in situations, we have several districts, our neighbors, who have external or peer teams, and those folks are actually an additional cost to the district. And so as we move forward, those are considerations, absolutely.
And my final question was, how are you evaluating teachers based on student achievement for those teachers who teach untested subjects?
Well, and that's an excellent question, is when we're talking about treating teachers fairly, it would be unfair to treat the teachers who are state tested differently than the teachers who are not state tested. So we've adopted the model that the state has offered, the student learning objective model, and that's where no matter what content area you teach or what grade level you teach, it's about what are the expected growth measures, or what's the student growth expectation, and then what's the performance to that expectation. So all content areas and grade levels are doing that regardless of whether they're state tested or not.
My question is, what is the breakdown? Like, what percent is TCAP, what percent is interim assessments, what percent is whatever? And it sounds like it may be different from school, or how does that work?
The law requires that the assessments with the highest technical rigor have the highest weight. So if TCAP is the only assessment in a teacher's body of evidence that has the highest technical rigor, and what I mean by that is has the highest statistical validity and reliability, then it would be weighted higher than the other measures. However, If you have 5 measures in your body of evidence, and TCAP is one of them, it may be weighted the highest, but it doesn't outweigh the other 4. So we have the flexibility in the law to value each measure, but not overvalue any of the measures.
So it would differ for school then?
It would depend on what their balanced assessment system is.
Okay, and then my next question is, we hear a lot about these opting out of tests. So if the TCAP is that high and the parent opts the student out of TCAP, how does that impact the teacher?
Well, there's opting out of a lot of testing, and I know it's because there's a lot of testing happening. And so that's an issue, because part of what we need to do is determine how do we have a voice in reducing the requirements of the tests happening and increase the amount of assessment practices that are meaningful to the teaching and the learning. And so that balancing act is a really tough one.
So the state doesn't have any, like, if a student doesn't take the TCAP, then the teacher is going to be penalized.
Well, the group of students that would be pulled out of TCAP for that teacher would just not include any of that student just wouldn't be included.
So, because my son has disabilities and we're in a very small school at DCSD. So when our kids don't take the TCAP, we get a 0, which heavily impacts our school. So is that going to happen to the teachers, or is it just going to be like they were never, not counted at all? Or is it going to be a 0?
The student would not be included in their TCAP measure, but if they have 4 other measures and your student is being assessed with those measures, then your student would be represented in the other 4 measures. Yeah.
With the option, the state's option versus our district choosing to develop their own assessment evaluation, and we've suffered millions of dollars in cuts, how much is this costing our district to use this and create this rather than if we just use the state's already built assessment?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because her question is, if the state has an option, then why don't we just adopt that option? The state has an evaluation system for standards 1 through 5. They have nothing for standard 6. They have guidance to districts to help us work through it, but they have no model for standard 6.
And my question was, how much does it cost us? How much is it costing our district?
To develop standard 6?
Well, just this whole thing, and rather than adopting the states and waiting until we can get our budget back under control.
I wouldn't know the answer to that. I could answer the question around standard 6, but I wouldn't know the answer to the whole thing.
So is standard 6 then not mandatory if the state doesn't have standard 6? Why are we implementing this when we don't even have our evaluation set properly yet?
Standard 6 is mandatory as part of SB 191.
But the state doesn't have it complete yet, so how?
They're not completing the model. They're providing guidance for the districts to create their own.
So basically, the state is expecting every district to fund the resources necessary to create whatever we need to for standard 6. But they're not giving us a prototype per se. So is the state going to then allocate money to each district because they don't have anything that we can use, and we have to use our own resources to create something? Is there any talk about the state helping finance that?
The question is around the funding support for standard 6, and there has been no conversation around compensating districts for the cost associated with doing the work around standard 6.
I want to go back to someone who talked about the consistency of the schools with the assessments that might be used. You had mentioned that the educator impact rating would be the same. Is the district going to look at one universal assessment or something that all the schools can use so we have that reliability and that validity that's the same across all schools, that we can do comparisons from school to school? Because if we're all using different assessments, even though the inter-rater reliability might be the same, we don't know at what level those kids are achieving at each school if we're not using some consistent test that's the same across the district.
Well, there's two ways to have a correlation of performance. And one is by administering the same assessment to everybody. The other is to have the same learning expectations, and the tool is then demonstrating performance on that. What's really important in that case is that any school-wide assessments are then correlated to each other. So if one school is giving MAP and one school is giving the district interim, then those assessments, the performance levels have to be correlated so that it's an equal to an equal. If my student is proficient level on this one, then they should also, if they took that assessment, be proficient on this. And so we are doing those analyses on the assessments that are school-wide.
When do you anticipate having the standards for principals, and are you going to have a hold harmless year for the principals as well?
Yes, this year's the hold harmless year for principals. We will have the model ready before the end of this first semester, and they will be implementing it. The teachers are also implementing the model. The full staff, all teachers, are implementing it at the end of the semester as well. So the principals and teachers will actually be on the same time frame. The reason why we can move more quickly with the principals is because their model is an aggregate of a portion of the data that comes from the school-wide as well, but they also have their own elements related to school effectiveness. So what we're learning and the structures that we're putting into place for the teachers can then be replicated for the principals, but with the measures that have to be in theirs. So the model can be similar, and what goes in the bucket can be different.
This might be a question for David or Becky, but can the District Accountability Committee put together some information about how much this is costing taxpayers and how much it's taking away from, I mean, our SACs and our schools are having to do massive fundraisers, and I think it's fair that we know how much this is costing our district and our taxpayers. Is that something you guys can research for us, please?
Absolutely. So you're asking not just about the standard 6, but the whole testing thing is about.
Because
Sure.
we chose to not use the states, how much is it costing our district?
Absolutely. We can pass that question up, and we've got folks taking notes in the back, so we'll pass the question up, and then I'll email you when it's going to hit the site.
And can you do the same on the teacher evaluation as well, since we chose not to use the teacher evaluation for the state?
Sure.
Excellent. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Do we have any other questions?
Just one last question about charters. Sorry. So if you said some charters are choosing to be a part of this, it will always be a choice for our charter schools, or is it going to be eventually just mandated?
There's competing opinions about that, and so at some point I imagine one or the other will weigh in totally, and it'll go one way or another. And so the Colorado Legacy Foundation is part of that conversation, and then CDE is part of that conversation, and then legislation. So it's part of that whole rulemaking process of having to change what's currently in law, not necessarily the law, but the rules stated in the law. So.
Is there a timeline on when we'll be able to actually know how our school is specifically doing this? I mean, because you've got all of these, it seems super complicated to me, like corporate America, we're all kind of the same. You know, my evaluation is not different than somebody who's in human resources. So I want to know what measures my school is doing, what students they're measuring. I want to know what that looks like. So when can we get data on that? So where it's specific.
So the question is, when are tangible parts of the model going to be able to be viewed by the public. The first step in the process is for the schools to finalize their school level model, and that will have the assessment categories in it, and then within that assessment category, that'll find the exact assessment that they'll be laying out. That timeline is by the end of the semester, all of that will be completed and ready for implementation. Now, just to add on to your question though, the balanced assessment system in your school has already been in existence for several years, so that information is ready to be shared. Can I just say one thing? If you have any questions and you're like me and you don't like to just yell out in the crowd, go ahead and email to me, because your questions actually help me continue to update the talking points associated with Standard 6, because it is really a new thing, and I just want to make sure everyone has a very clear understanding of it. So any questions you have that weren't brought up, you can email to me.
I thought of one more, just real quick. How is the Standard 6 committee created at each school? Who's in charge of making that? Who's in charge of making that committee?
So the Standard 6 committee at each school, that was part of the role of the school leadership in collaboration with the staff, having representatives from the different teacher groups to make sure that all the teacher groups were represented.